The rain poured steadily on the quiet streets of Chicago, creating an eerie stillness despite the bustling city that surrounded it. The cold, biting drops of rain mixed with the fog from the wet asphalt, making the air feel heavy, almost suffocating. The reflections of dim yellow streetlights and passing cars shimmered in the puddles that had collected along the sidewalks, adding a mysterious glow to the otherwise dark and dreary night. The familiar sounds of honking horns, footsteps rushing to destinations, and the distant roar of the city echoed in the distance. Yet there was an undeniable sense of isolation in this corner of the world, where time seemed to slow down. Amid the ordinary chaos, one figure stood out against the wet backdrop. A large, imposing Rottweiler sat motionless just outside a butcher shop, its dark eyes locked onto the slabs of fresh meat hanging behind the glass. The dog was not whining, nor was it barking. There were no signs of desperation or pleading. It was simply waiting. Waiting for what, no one could tell. But there was an undeniable sense of purpose in the way the dog held itself. It wasn't the frantic, desperate hunger of a stray animal, but the quiet patience of something far more disciplined. This was Sargent. Once, Sargent had been more than just a dog. He had been a K-9 officer, trained to track criminals, apprehend suspects, and protect his handler in the most dangerous of situations. In his prime, Sargent had been a powerhouse, muscular, fast, and fiercely loyal. He had lived his life by the orders given to him, following every command with unwavering obedience. Sargent had been a warrior in the truest sense of the word, ready to charge into any situation without hesitation. His name alone was a testament to his strength, his loyalty, and his ability to lead. But that was before. Now, Sargent was a shadow of the dog he once was. After a traumatic injury during a high-speed chase, Sargent had been deemed unfit for service. The injury to his leg had robbed him of the speed and agility that had once made him a force to be reckoned with. It was a cruel twist of fate for a dog that had once been at the top of his game. The injury had taken away his sense of purpose, and it had taken away his handler, the man who had once trusted him, who had once been his entire world. Sargent had been left behind. The system had failed him. Instead of retiring in comfort with his handler, Sargent found himself tossed into the cold, impersonal world of animal shelters. He had been sent to a place that promised to find him a new home, a second chance. But somewhere along the way, the paperwork had gotten lost, the system had failed, and Sargent had found himself once again abandoned. Instead of finding a loving family, he had been discarded like a broken tool. Left to roam the streets, he had become just another stray dog in the city, barely surviving on scraps of food and the kindness of strangers that were few and far between. Now here he was, sitting in front of a butcher shop in the rain, his once sleek and muscular body now gaunt and frail. His coat, which had once been thick and shiny, was now matted and streaked with dirt. His fur had patches missing, exposing the scars beneath, a reminder of the battles he had fought, both physical and emotional. His ribs were visible beneath his taut skin, and his paws trembled slightly from the cold that seeped through the wet pavement. The harshness of life on the streets had taken its toll on Sargent, and yet, in this moment, he remained unmoving. His eyes, dark and intense, never left the meat hanging inside the butcher shop. The rich, savory scent filled the air, tugging at his starving stomach. It had been days since he had eaten anything substantial, and the hunger gnawed at him. But still, Sargent did not move. He did not bark or whine or make any noise that might attract attention. He simply waited. It was as if he had learned to wait for something, anything, to happen, though he no longer had the strength to chase it, nor the command to follow. Unlike the other stray dogs that scavenged through dumpsters or darted between alleys looking for their next meal, Sargent was different. His discipline, ingrained over years of training, held him back. He would not steal. He would not beg. He had been taught to obey, to follow orders, and even now, with nothing left to protect, he remained true to the training that had defined him. He was a soldier without orders, a warrior without a mission. Most of the people who walked past him barely gave him a second glance. Some hurried their steps, avoiding the uncomfortable sight of a dog in need. Others might have glanced at him a bit longer, feeling a pang of sympathy before moving on with their busy lives. No one stopped. No one offered to help. The world was too busy to notice a dog like Sargent, an animal discarded by the very system that had once relied on him. But Sargent didn't need their pity. His life had been defined by duty, and even now, in his broken state, he held on to that sense of purpose. He waited, as if he was still waiting for an order, waiting for someone to recognize him for what he had been, for what he could still be. The rain fell harder, but Sargent didn't flinch. His body shivered with the cold, but he remained stoic, unmoving, his eyes locked on the butcher's window, his gaze as sharp and focused as ever. The world around him continued its frenetic pace, but Sargent was detached, standing still in the eye of the storm. His name, Sargent, was a reminder of what he had been, a symbol of strength and discipline. It had always been about service for Sargent. He had served his handler, served his country, served his purpose. But now, without a command, he was just another dog, lost in the chaos of the world, abandoned and forgotten. And yet there was still something in his gaze, something that suggested he wasn't done yet. Something that told anyone who cared to look closely that Sargent still had a story to tell. He wasn't just another stray dog. He was more than that. He was a soldier, waiting for his next mission. Even in the heart of a cold, indifferent city, Sargent was still waiting for something or someone to give him a reason to move again. Jeffrey stood behind the counter of his small butcher shop, his eyes barely lifting from the knife he was using to slice through a fresh cut of beef. The shop was quiet, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the soft sound of the rain tapping against the windows. It was a typical night in Chicago, wet, cold, and lonely. The neon lights from a nearby street sign cast a faint glow through the windows, but the darkness of the evening seemed to swallow everything up. Jeffrey had grown used to the solitude that filled his life, but it still gnawed at him, especially on nights like this. Once, not long ago, he had lived a life full of purpose, a life that had been both challenging and meaningful. As a young man, he had enlisted in the military, where he quickly became part of a close-knit unit. There he had found camaraderie, loyalty, and the sense that he was working toward something bigger than himself. But that was before. That was before the war ended, and before his world had collapsed in a whirlwind of loss and trauma. When he returned home, the life he had known was gone. His comrades, the ones he had trusted with his life, were no longer there. And the mission that had kept him moving forward every day, had been taken from him. Jeffrey came back to a life that felt empty, unimportant, and without direction. The butcher shop had become his refuge, but it had also become a prison. He threw himself into his work, chopping meat, arranging cuts, and keeping the place running, but every task felt mechanical. It was a life without joy, a life where every day was a repetition of the last. His customers came and went, but no one ever stayed long enough to truly notice him. He had no one to talk to about his days in the military, no one who understood the weight he carried from his time in combat, and so he kept it all inside, letting the silence of the shop swallow him up. He lived in a kind of fog, drifting through life without a sense of real purpose. That was until he saw him, Sargent. The dog had been sitting outside his shop for hours now, unmoving, staring intently at the meat hanging in the window. It was a cold, rainy night, the kind where most people would be huddled inside, escaping the chill. But there the dog was, sitting rigidly, as if he had a job to do. His large Rottweiler frame was drenched from the rain, his coat matted and streaked with dirt. But there was something about the way he sat, still, composed and focused, that struck a chord with Jeffrey. It was as if the dog was waiting for something, something that Jeffrey couldn't quite place. As he wiped his hands on his apron, Jeffrey walked over to the door and opened it. He hadn't planned on interacting with the dog, but something in the way the animal looked at him made him pause. It wasn't the frantic gaze of a stray desperate for food. No, this was different. This was a dog that seemed disciplined. Its eyes were steady, its posture unyielding. It was almost as if it was on a mission of its own, just waiting for the right moment to act. Jeffrey knelt down and extended his hand, offering a piece of meat from his counter. "You hungry?" he asked softly, his voice carrying just enough warmth to break the silence of the night. The dog didn't respond right away, but its eyes never left Jeffrey's. For a long moment, the two of them just stared at each other, the rain continuing to fall around them. Then slowly, Sergeant's ears twitched, and the dog took a tentative step forward. It didn't lunge for the meat. Instead, it took it gently, almost cautiously, as if unsure whether it could trust the man offering it. That small act, the way Sergeant took the food, struck Jeffrey in a way he hadn't expected. There was a calmness to the dog, a level of restraint that reminded him of his own time in the military. It was the same kind of control he had learned to master when he was in uniform, when every action had a purpose, every step was calculated. And then it hit him. Sergeant wasn't just a dog. He was like him. He had once been part of something bigger, part of a team, a mission. He had once had purpose. But now he was alone, abandoned, with no clear direction, just like Jeffrey. Jeffrey felt a pang in his chest as he realized that this dog, sitting in the rain, was just like him. Lost, abandoned, and in need of something to hold on to. Sergeant's body was scarred, but his eyes still held that quiet determination, the same determination that had once made him a warrior. Jeffrey could see it in the way the dog carried himself, even now, despite everything he had been through. He could see the same resilience in Sergeant that he saw in himself every day, the same refusal to give up even when it felt like there was nothing left. The realization hit Jeffrey hard. Sergeant needed something. He needed a reason to keep going, just like Jeffrey did. And in that moment, something shifted inside Jeffrey. He realized that maybe, just maybe, taking care of Sergeant could give him the purpose he had been searching for, the thing that had been missing from his life. Maybe helping this dog find his way back to a sense of belonging could help him find his way too. From that moment on, Sergeant wasn't just a stray dog sitting outside a butcher shop. He was something more. He was a reminder to Jeffrey that even after everything had fallen apart, there was still hope. There was still the possibility of rebuilding, of finding a new mission, a new reason to live. And just like that, Jeffrey understood. Sergeant wasn't the only one who needed saving. In the days that followed their first meeting, Jeffrey found himself thinking more and more about Sergeant, the dog that had appeared like a shadow on the rainy streets outside his butcher shop. Though the bond had started with something as simple as offering a piece of meat, there was a sense that something more profound was beginning to form between them. Sergeant, at first, had not seemed interested in any human kindness. He had sat stoically, waiting for something, perhaps a sign that the world was willing to acknowledge him, but not yet willing to trust again. The first time Jeffrey had offered Sergeant food, the dog's hesitation was palpable. He had extended his hand, the piece of meat held out in a gesture of simple kindness, but Sergeant had not moved immediately. Instead, the dog had studied him carefully, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. It was as though Sergeant was searching for something in Jeffrey's face, trying to decipher whether this was another trick, another false promise from a world that had let him down too many times before. Jeffrey had seen the hesitation in Sergeant's eyes, the reluctance to trust again, and it mirrored his own feelings of skepticism. Jeffrey understood more than anyone how hard it was to trust after betrayal. But he didn't give up. Slowly, gently, Jeffrey extended his hand again, offering the meat without a hint of urgency. He wasn't rushing Sargent. He wasn't forcing anything. Instead, he simply waited. In the stillness of the moment, he could feel something shift in the air, as if the quiet patience between them spoke volumes more than words ever could. Finally, Sargent took a small step forward. It wasn't a desperate lunge for food. It was measured, cautious, and deliberate. With a soft movement, Sargent took the meat, his eyes never leaving Jeffrey's. There was no snatching, no quickness, just the steady, deliberate motion of a dog who had learned the value of patience, and perhaps the first seed of trust was planted. As the days passed, their interactions became more routine. Sargent began to show up regularly outside the butcher shop, often waiting patiently as if he knew what was coming. Every time Jeffrey approached, the dog would watch him, always with that quiet, intense gaze. Though there were no signs of affection, no wagging tail or jumping excitement, Jeffrey noticed that the dog's posture became less tense with each passing day. Slowly, the distance between them began to shrink, not through force, but through mutual understanding. It wasn't until a week later that their bond truly deepened, and the test of their relationship came in the form of a violent threat, a situation that would prove whether Sargent's trust in Jeffrey was real and whether their connection went beyond just food and routine. One cold, stormy evening, as Jeffrey was locking up the butcher shop for the night, a group of masked men barged through the door. They were armed and angry, their voices harsh as they demanded money from the register. Jeffrey's heart raced as he backed away, trying to avoid confrontation. But the men were quick, pushing him toward the counter and knocking him to the floor. The air was thick with tension as they ransacked the register, oblivious to the quiet presence of Sargent, who had been resting in his usual spot just inside the shop. Jeffrey tried to gather himself, his mind racing for a way to protect himself, but he was disoriented from the blow to his head. That's when Sargent moved. Without a moment's hesitation, the dog sprang to his feet. Despite the injuries he had suffered in the past, Sargent seemed to shed his pain and weakness, his instincts kicking in like they had been trained for this very moment. With a low growl, he charged toward the men, using the full force of his powerful frame to knock one of them to the ground. The other men yelled in surprise, but Sargent, though injured, wasn't deterred. He lunged at the second attacker, his sharp teeth sinking into the arm of the man who had been holding Jeffrey down. Jeffrey's heart raced as he struggled to his feet, watching in awe as Sargent fought off the attackers. The dog was a force of nature, a machine of defense and loyalty. Each move was calculated, and with every strike, he showed that he was not just a pet, but a trained protector. Jeffrey had seen firsthand what Sargent was capable of when it mattered most, when his loyalty was tested and when someone he cared about was in danger. The fight continued with Sargent relentlessly defending Jeffrey. The men, caught off guard by the ferocity of the dog, were quickly overpowered. They scrambled to escape, leaving behind their weapons and the threat of harm. Sargent stood firm, guarding the entrance to the butcher shop as the intruders fled into the night. When the danger passed and the adrenaline began to wear off, Jeffrey collapsed against the counter, his body still shaking from the confrontation. His eyes met Sargent's, and for the first time, he saw something in the dog's eyes. Something that wasn't just about training, but about a bond that had been forged in the heat of danger. The trust was no longer one-sided. It had become mutual. Sargent wasn't just a dog looking for food or a place to stay. He had become a partner, a protector, and in that moment, Jeffrey understood the depth of their connection. Sargent had risked his life for Jeffrey without hesitation, without question, and Jeffrey knew without a doubt that the dog had done so because he had begun to trust him. The bond between them wasn't just about food or shelter. It was about something deeper: loyalty, duty, and the understanding that no one was truly alone, not when they had someone they could rely on. The days following the violent encounter with the intruders had been a turning point for both Jeffrey and Sargent. The bond between them, tested in the heat of danger, had grown deeper and more profound. Yet, despite Sargent's courage and the newfound trust between them, there was still the matter of what to do next. Jeffrey knew that Sargent had saved him, but he also realized that the dog wasn't just a protector. Sargent was a soul lost in need of healing. As much as Sargent had come to rely on Jeffrey, the truth was, Jeffrey had just as much to learn about healing and second chances, and that's where Jessica came into the picture. Jessica had been a constant presence in the neighborhood, someone everyone knew and trusted. As an animal rescuer, she had dedicated her life to saving animals in distress, especially those that had been abandoned or mistreated. It wasn't just the physical scars that interested Jessica. It was the emotional damage that so often went unnoticed. Animals, she knew, didn't just suffer from hunger or neglect. They also carried the invisible wounds of trauma and heartbreak. Over the years, she had learned how to gently help them heal, teaching them to trust again, even when their world had been shattered. When Jessica first met Sargent, she had recognized something special in him, a strength and potential that was often overlooked by others. One rainy afternoon, Jeffrey had finally worked up the courage to reach out to Jessica. He needed help. As much as he wanted to believe that he could help Sargent, he knew he wasn't equipped to truly guide the dog through its recovery. The trauma that Sargent had endured in his past, the battles, the injury, the abandonment, ran deep, and Jeffrey felt uncertain about how to provide the care Sargent so desperately needed. Jessica listened carefully as Jeffrey shared Sargent's story, and she could see the concern in his eyes. She knew that Sargent wasn't just any dog. She could sense the quiet power he held, but she also saw the hesitation and the residual pain in his eyes. "He's a warrior," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But he's not just a soldier. He's a dog that has been through so much, and now he's lost. He doesn't know how to heal, but he can." Jessica understood the healing process better than anyone. She had seen countless animals like Sargent, animals who had been broken, abandoned, and forgotten. But what she also knew was that these animals were survivors. They had a strength inside them, a will to move forward, even if it was just a tiny spark. Sargent's story wasn't over, and Jessica believed that with the right care, he could reclaim his life, his purpose. "I know it's hard," Jessica said to Jeffrey one evening, sitting in the quiet warmth of his butcher shop. "But Sargent isn't just a fighting dog. He's got a lot more inside him. He's a fighter, yes, but there's also a lot of love and loyalty left in him. You've seen it, Jeffrey. He's already starting to trust you, but he needs to learn how to trust again. It'll take time. But you can help him. You're not alone in this." Jessica's words rang in Jeffrey's mind as he looked at Sargent, lying quietly by his side. He realized that Jessica was right. Sargent wasn't just a tool for protection or a symbol of loyalty. He was a living, breathing being who had been through more than his fair share of pain. And now, just like Jeffrey, he needed a reason to live again. Over the following weeks, Jessica became a key figure in both Jeffrey and Sargent's journey. She visited often, offering advice and guidance on how to help Sargent recover. "You've got to give him room to breathe, Jeffrey," she explained one afternoon as they sat in the back of the shop sipping coffee. "You can't rush it. You can't force him to be something he's not ready to be. He needs time to heal emotionally, just like he's healing physically. Let him have space, but also give him the love he needs to feel safe." At first, Jeffrey was uncertain. He had never been one to be overly patient with his emotions. But Jessica's steady hand, her calm demeanor, and her deep understanding of animals began to rub off on him. He started seeing Sargent not just as a companion or a protector, but as a friend in need. When they weren't working together, Jeffrey began spending time with Sargent in quieter, softer ways, long walks through the neighborhood, sitting on the porch in the evenings, sharing his thoughts with a dog who never judged him. Slowly but surely, Sargent began to respond. The tension in his body started to soften. His eyes, once clouded with suspicion, began to look at Jeffrey with a glimmer of trust. Jessica's encouragement was vital. She helped Jeffrey understand that Sargent's journey wasn't just about surviving, it was about learning to live again. "Let him have a purpose," she advised one day. "Not every dog has to be a soldier, Jeffrey. He might never go back to the kind of work he did before, but he can still be something important to you. He can still be a partner, and that's what he needs. A place where he belongs." Jessica's words resonated with Jeffrey. He began to think about Sargent differently, not as a broken soldier, but as a living, breathing soul who deserved a second chance at life. He began to give Sargent small tasks around the shop, allowing him to feel needed, to feel useful again. Whether it was retrieving the newspaper in the morning or sitting by the door to watch over the shop, Sargent slowly began to regain a sense of purpose. Jeffrey had never been the type of person to admit that he needed help, but Jessica had shown him how much he could offer Sargent by simply being there for him. Jessica's visits became less frequent as Sargent grew more comfortable with his new routine, but Jeffrey knew that he could always count on her if he needed guidance. Her belief in Sargent and in him had been the spark that helped ignite their transformation. She had helped him see beyond the wounds and scars, both physical and emotional, and helped him understand the power of patience, trust, and love. Eventually, Sargent stopped being just the dog outside the butcher shop. He became part of the family, a constant presence at Jeffrey's side, always there to offer comfort, protection, and most of all, companionship. He had gone from a dog on the streets, abandoned and broken, to a loyal and loving partner who had found a new purpose in life. And Jeffrey, for the first time in a long while, had found a sense of peace, knowing that he wasn't alone in this world. He had Sargent, and he had Jessica, two souls who in their own ways had given him the hope he thought he had lost. One afternoon, as the soft hum of the butcher shop's refrigerator filled the air, Jeffrey glanced up to see a familiar face entering the door. It was Chris, a former K-9 handler and a close friend from Jeffrey's days in the military. The years had added some graying to his hair and a few more lines to his face, but there was no mistaking the sharpness in his eyes. The same eyes that had once scanned the battlefield for danger, and the same eyes that now seemed to size up everything in the room. Chris had always been a steady presence in Jeffrey's life, a brother in arms who had witnessed the sacrifices and losses that come with being part of a K-9 unit. Over the years, they'd shared their stories, their fears, and their triumphs. But the bond they had wasn't just about military service. It was also about understanding the weight of the world on each other's shoulders. They had both seen their fair share of pain, but neither had ever fully recovered from the losses they had suffered. Chris stepped inside, his gaze immediately falling on Sargent, who was resting by the counter. The dog was quietly observing, as he often did, his eyes sharp, but his body still and reserved. Chris didn't need to say anything to understand the dog's story. He could see the battle scars that ran deeper than just the physical. He knew what it was like to be abandoned, to feel like you had no purpose left. "Looks like he's been through hell," Chris said, his voice low, his eyes softening with empathy as he looked at Sargent. Jeffrey nodded, a heavy weight settling on his chest. "He's not just a stray," Jeffrey replied, his voice tinged with concern. "He's been through more than most people ever will, and I'm not sure how to help him find his way back." Chris leaned against the counter, his gaze still on Sargent, his thoughts clearly far away. "You know, I've seen a dog just like him before. A K-9 we worked with. He was left behind after a mission went wrong, lost everything. His partner, his job, his purpose." Jeffrey's curiosity piqued as he listened closely. Chris didn't often talk about their old K-9s, and this sounded like it might hit close to home. The dog's name was Rex, Chris continued, his voice steady, but there was a hint of nostalgia mixed with regret. He was a powerhouse, just like Sargent, the best of the best, but after the mission they didn't want him anymore. They said he was too old, too damaged. Chris paused, the memory clearly weighing on him. We couldn't find him a home. He ended up being left at a shelter. But one day, we got a call from a family that had adopted him. They were patient with him, gave him a chance to heal. It wasn't easy at first, but Rex slowly came around. He stopped flinching every time someone reached out. He started trusting again. Chris's story hit Jeffrey hard. The parallels between Rex and Sargent were undeniable. Just like Rex, Sargent had been abandoned, left to face the world alone, without purpose or direction. Jeffrey had been doing his best to help, but hearing Chris's story made him realize that maybe he needed to take a step back and let Sargent find his own way, at his own pace. But Rex, he came back, Chris added, his voice filled with quiet pride. He didn't just learn to trust again, he found a new purpose. He was the family's protector. He made sure their kids were safe. He even started to play again, like he'd forgotten how to. It took time, but Rex became the dog he was always meant to be. He wasn't just a K9 anymore. He was a companion, a protector, and he found happiness. The words hit Jeffrey with a surge of hope, mixed with an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He had been so focused on trying to get Sargent to heal quickly, to get him back to being the soldier he once was, that he hadn't realized the most important thing was letting Sargent find his own way back to life, slowly, steadily, and with the right support. "Don't rush it, Jeff," Chris said, his gaze now meeting Jeffrey's. "Let him heal at his own pace. Sargent's been through hell just like Rex. But he'll come back. He has it in him. You just have to be patient with him. Let him find a reason to live again. Let him find his purpose. And remember, it's not about him going back to being a K9. It's about him finding his place in this world. With you." Jeffrey's heart swelled with gratitude. He had been so focused on the past, so intent on making Sargent the dog he once was, that he hadn't considered what Sargent really needed. A chance to move forward, to build a new life, not defined by the wars he had fought, but by the love and trust he could share now. Chris's words stuck with Jeffrey long after the conversation ended. He began to approach Sargent differently. Instead of pushing him to return to his old ways, Jeffrey started giving Sargent more space, more time to just be. He found new ways to bond, to share quiet moments, and to offer Sargent a purpose that wasn't tied to his military training. Slowly, Sargent began to trust again. He started following Jeffrey more willingly around the shop, watching over him as he worked, showing small signs of affection that Jeffrey hadn't seen before. And with each day that passed, Jeffrey could see that Sargent was coming back, not to the dog he had been, but to the dog he was meant to be in this new chapter of his life. Chris had given Jeffrey a gift that day, not just advice, but the reassurance that Sargent could heal. And with patience and time, he could find his place in the world again. Just like Rex, Sargent could learn to trust again, to find happiness, and to live a life filled with purpose once more. The evening had fallen dark and cold over the butcher shop once again, the soft glow of the street lamps casting shadows that stretched across the wet pavement. Inside, Jeffrey was locking up for the night, his thoughts drifting between the quiet comfort of his shop and the new rhythm he had started to find with Sargent. The dog had been by his side more than ever these past few weeks, showing small signs of affection, regaining some of his old confidence. They had become a team, a partnership that had blossomed in the wake of hardship and trauma. For once, Jeffrey felt a flicker of hope that things were finally falling into place, but that sense of peace was shattered in an instant. The door to the butcher shop slammed open, and a group of masked men stormed in, brandishing guns with a menacing air of finality. They shouted demands at Jeffrey, their voices harsh and full of threat. He didn't have time to think, to react, only to act. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a quick step back, instinctively reaching for the nearest object for protection. But the men were already closing in, their weapons aimed directly at him, their intentions clear. They weren't just here to rob him, they were here to kill. In that moment, Sargent sprang into action, the dog's protective instincts kicking in as if nothing had changed. Despite the injuries still fresh on his body, Sargent was right there, standing between Jeffrey and the intruders without hesitation. Jeffrey had never seen him move like this before. There was a primal energy in the way Sargent threw himself into the fray, fearless and driven by a deep sense of duty. The dog wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for Jeffrey's life, protecting him at all costs. The scene exploded into chaos. Sargent lunged at one of the attackers, his teeth finding the arm of the man holding a gun. The gunshot rang out, but it missed, and in the confusion, the attacker stumbled back, his weapon dropping. Sargent was relentless, his movements calculated and swift, pushing the intruders back, trying to protect Jeffrey at every turn. The tension in the air was thick with danger, and every second felt like an eternity. The violence was raw and intense, and the sound of growling, shouting, and the clash of bodies echoed through the shop. Jeffrey's pulse raced as he tried to gain his bearings, but he couldn't take his eyes off Sargent, who was standing his ground, defending him with all his might. In a final, desperate push, one of the criminals managed to knock Sargent off balance, sending him crashing to the ground. The dog staggered, injured but still determined to fight. Jeffrey, heart in his throat, knew what had to happen next. The last of the attackers turned to flee, but not before a final struggle ensued. Sargent, despite the blood dripping from his side, stood once more, lunging at the retreating figure, making sure the threat was fully gone. But the damage had been done. Sargent's injuries were worse than Jeffrey had realized. Blood soaked into the dog's fur as he limped toward Jeffrey, his strength fading. He collapsed at Jeffrey's feet, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide with pain, but still holding the familiar trust and loyalty that had always been there. Jeffrey knelt down beside him, panic rising in his chest as he gently cradled the dog's head. The weight of the situation hit Jeffrey hard in that moment. Sargent had saved his life, again. But the dog was hurt, and now it was up to Jeffrey to make a choice. He could have panicked, could have let the fear overwhelm him, but instead, something deep within him stirred. Sargent wasn't just an animal. He wasn't just a tool or a pet. Sargent was his partner, his protector, his friend. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and in that moment, Jeffrey realized that his duty was clear. He would not let Sargent face this alone. He had a responsibility to the dog who had given so much. Without a second thought, Jeffrey lifted Sargent into his arms and rushed out the door. He drove straight to the nearest veterinary hospital, his hands trembling on the wheel, his heart racing. When they arrived, the veterinary staff quickly took over, but Jeffrey stayed by Sargent's side, never once leaving him. He had to be there for the dog, just as the dog had always been there for him. The next few hours were a blur of medical procedures, the hum of machines, and the quiet beeping of monitors. Jeffrey didn't care about the time passing. All that mattered was the dog in front of him, fighting for his life. In the silence of the waiting room, Jeffrey reflected on everything that had led them here, the trials, the struggles, the moments of doubt. And yet, through it all, Sargent had stayed true to him, a loyal companion in every sense. Eventually, the doctor emerged, her face softening as she gave him the news. Sargent was going to be okay. The injuries were severe, but the dog was strong, and with care, he would recover. Relief flooded through Jeffrey, but so did something else. A deep sense of gratitude and love for the dog who had become so much more than a protector. He was a true friend, and in that moment, Jeffrey made a vow. No matter what happened, he would never let Sargent down. The dog had given him everything in that fight, his strength, his loyalty, and his life. As he sat beside Sergeant, gently petting his fur and listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, Jeffrey realized something else. He wasn't just saving Sergeant. Sergeant had saved him too. Eternal connection. After everything, Sergeant had not only regained his strength, but he had also found the love and care he truly deserved. The bond between Jeffrey, Sergeant, Jessica, and Chris grew stronger as they looked forward with renewed faith in life. Together, they proved that healing is not only about physical recovery, but also about rebuilding trust, finding a sense of belonging, and embracing the companionship that transcends words. This story is a testament to the resilience of both animals and humans, illustrating how deeply the love between them can run, and how much healing can occur when we give one another the time and space to grow. As the story comes to a close, we see Jeffrey and Sergeant sitting side by side, gazing out the window, two souls once broken, now at peace. The war they fought had not only been against the world outside, but also within themselves. And in that quiet moment, both man and dog had found the stillness and serenity that had eluded them for so long. Their journey had come full circle, and together, they had found home. Share your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story. Together, we can shine a light on the power of doing what's right. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.